Among the 17 known civilizations that had achieved faster-than-light travel, exactly 0 had ever questioned the fundamental assumption that intelligence meant solving problems through careful analysis, methodical deduction, and an appreciation for elegant complexity. This oversight would prove to be spectacularly expensive. The Galactic Military Academy's Tactical Assessment Chamber represented the pinnacle of psychological evaluation technology. Carved from a single block of crystallized quantum foam and suspended in a null gravity field, the chamber had been designed by the finest minds of the Zlithian Empire. A species so intellectually refined they considered chess a contact sport. Every surface gleamed with holographic interfaces, each one more unnecessarily complicated than the last, because apparently the best way to test military leadership was to see how many floating geometric shapes one could manipulate simultaneously while reciting the periodic table backwards. For the past 3 centuries, the Academy's most prestigious challenge had remained undefeated. The Escape Protocol, as it was formerly known, required cadets to navigate 17 interconnected puzzles within a 30-minute time limit. Success meant graduation with honors. Failure meant spending another semester learning about the proper etiquette for surrendering to superior alien cultures, which was apparently a required course. The current class of cadets represented the cream of galactic civilization. There was the Zentarian, whose cranium had been surgically expanded to accommodate his species' preference for overthinking everything. The crystalline being from Kepler 42b, who could process 17,000 variables simultaneously but needed 3 hours to decide what to eat for breakfast. And approximately 40 other specimens of various tentacled, scaled, or geometrically impossible anatomy, all united by their shared conviction that the universe was a puzzle waiting to be solved through the application of sufficient intellectual superiority. Then there was the human. She sat in the corner of the preparation chamber, a creature so physiologically unremarkable that several instructors had initially mistaken her for a piece of furniture. No enhanced cranium, no crystalline neural matrices, no visible signs of the genetic modifications that had become standard among the civilized species. Her preparation for the challenge consisted of stretching her arms above her head and cracking her knuckles, which produced a sound that made 3 separate alien species immediately check their life insurance policies. Commander Vex Thule, whose species had evolved from apex predators but had since discovered that being apex predators was terribly impolite, observed the human with the sort of academic interest typically reserved for studying particularly virulent diseases. "Fascinating specimen," he murmured to his aide, a delicate creature whose ancestors had solved the problem of survival by becoming so intellectually superior that they had transcended the need for physical confrontation. The psychological profiles indicate an almost primitive approach to problem solving. The aide consulted his holographic clipboard, which was, naturally, shaped like a 17-dimensional hypercube, because regular clipboards were for species that hadn't discovered the joy of making simple things unnecessarily complex. The human scored remarkably low on the theoretical combat analysis examination. When presented with a scenario involving a fortified position defended by superior numbers with advanced weaponry, she wrote a single sentence, which was, "Go round." Commander Vex Thule's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture that his species used to indicate profound confusion or the onset of a migraine. "Go around what?" That was the extent of her answer. When pressed for elaboration, she added, and I quote, "Or under, or through, whatever's easiest." The Academy's escape chamber had been constructed according to the finest principles of galactic engineering, which meant it was designed to contain beings whose idea of breaking out involved manipulating exotic matter fields and solving differential equations. The walls were composed of standard military-grade polymer composite, approximately 6 inches thick, designed to withstand the sort of theoretical stresses that might be encountered during routine space combat. For creatures who had spent millennia perfecting the art of intellectual problem-solving, the walls might as well have been made of solid neutronium. Inside the chamber, holographic interfaces hummed with quiet efficiency, each one calibrated to test a different aspect of tactical thinking. The first puzzle alone required cadets to manipulate 17 separate energy fields while simultaneously decoding an ancient Marthari text and calculating the optimal trajectory for a theoretical spacecraft navigating a black hole's event horizon. Was elegant, sophisticated, and completely impossible for anyone with fewer than 4 functioning brain lobes. The human will likely require the full 30 minutes just to understand the first interface, observed the aide, whose name was an untranslatable sound that roughly corresponded to the feeling of intellectual superiority mixed with faint nausea. Her species hasn't even developed proper tentacles for manipulating multiple control surfaces. Commander Vextual nodded sagely. The Academy's records indicated that the average completion time for successful cadets was 28 minutes and 37 seconds, with most of that time spent on the final puzzle, which required solving a paradox about temporal mechanics while juggling. The chamber had been sealed with redundant security protocols, monitored by 47 separate sensor arrays, and equipped with enough backup systems to ensure that even if every single electronic component somehow failed simultaneously, the chamber would remain sealed until the time limit expired. It was, by any reasonable standard, escape-proof. The human stood up, cracked her neck with another sound that caused several instructors to involuntarily check their pulse readings, and walked toward the chamber entrance with the casual confidence of someone who had apparently never encountered a problem she couldn't solve by applying the appropriate amount of force to the appropriate location. 30 minutes, announced Commander Vextual as the chamber sealed behind her with the satisfying hiss of pressurizing gases. Beginning countdown now. Through the observation windows, the assembled instructors watched with academic interest as the human entered the pristine white chamber and was immediately surrounded by 17 holographic interfaces, each one pulsing with gentle, helpful light designed to guide her toward the first puzzle. The logical course of action would be to approach the central console, activate the primary interface, and begin the careful process of understanding the challenge ahead. Instead, she walked directly to the wall and knocked on it. The sound of knuckles meeting polymer composite echoed through the observation chamber like a death knell for several millennia of civilized problem-solving. Commander Vextual's aide dropped his 17-dimensional clipboard, which immediately began calculating the probability of its own existence while simultaneously questioning the nature of geometric reality. Is she examining the structural integrity? Whispered Dr. Coolmara, whose species had evolved beyond physical violence approximately 3 million years ago, and now considered harsh language to be a war crime. That's not how the chamber works. The chamber is a mental exercise. The walls are merely containment. The human continued her percussion survey of the wall's surface, moving methodically from section to section, with the focused attention of a creature that had apparently missed the memo about intellectual sophistication being superior to physical solutions. Each knock produced a slightly different tone, which he seemed to be cataloguing with the sort of professional interest that species typically reserved for complex mathematical theorems or fine wine. The chamber walls are 6 inches of military-grade composite, Commander Vextual said, though his voice carried the faint uncertainty of someone watching their fundamental assumptions about reality undergo rapid disassembly. They're designed to withstand direct impact from a Class VI energy weapon. Surely she's not suggesting... The human had stopped knocking and was now running her hands along the wall's surface, apparently searching for something that the Academy's finest engineers had somehow overlooked during 3 centuries of chamber operation. Her expression suggested the sort of mild, professional curiosity that other species displayed when encountering a particularly interesting crossword puzzle. Meanwhile, the 17 holographic interfaces continued their patient waiting, designed as they were for species that approach problems through careful intellectual analysis, rather than whatever psychological disorder was currently manifesting in the chamber. The first interface pulsed helpfully, projecting a gentle reminder that the challenge had officially begun, and that perhaps the human might consider acknowledging its existence before the 30-minute time limit expired. Yet she ignored it completely. According to the psychological profiles, the aide said, consulting a backup clipboard that had materialized from somewhere in his anatomically improbable sleeve, humans exhibit a tendency toward what their own experts classify as lateral thinking. This apparently means approaching problems from unexpected angles, rather than following logical progressive steps. How wonderfully primitive, murmured Dr. Quilmara. Though I suppose when one species lacks proper cognitive enhancement, one must make do with whatever crude approximations of intelligence evolution provides. The human had found something. She was examining a section of wall approximately 4 feet from the chamber's main entrance, running her fingers along what appeared to be a perfectly smooth surface. To the assembled observers, her actions seemed to lack any connection to rational thought processes. The wall was uniform, seamless, constructed according to specifications that had been reviewed by 17 different engineering committees and approved by the Academy's Department of "absolutely certain this will work." Then she placed both hands against the wall and pushed. The polymer composite, which had been designed to withstand theoretical energy weapons and hypothetical explosive decompression, had not been specifically engineered to resist a human applying approximately 200 pounds of direct physical pressure to what turned out to be the exact center of a structural support panel. The wall flexed slightly, producing a sound like a very large, very expensive mistake realizing it was about to happen. "That's impossible," said Commander Vextool, though his four eyes were rapidly dilating, in a manner that suggested his brain was processing information that contradicted several fundamental assumptions about physics. The structural integrity calculations clearly indicate. The human stepped back, examined the slight depression her hands had created in the wall, and nodded with the satisfaction of someone who had just confirmed a hypothesis about the universe's tendency to take shortcuts around elegant solutions. She raised her right leg, balanced herself against the opposite wall, and delivered a kick that would have been considered moderate by human standards, but was apparently sufficient to create a spider web of cracks radiating outward from the impact point. "Alert! Alert!" The chamber's security system began broadcasting in 17 different languages. Though its programming had been designed around scenarios involving escaped holographic interfaces or theoretical containment breaches, not whatever category of emergency was currently unfolding. "Structural integrity compromise detected. This is not supposed to happen. Please consult your manual." The human kicked the wall again. The cracks expanded. She's actually breaking through." Ulmara's voice had risen to a pitch that her species typically reserved for existential crises or discovering that their favorite intellectual puzzles had been solved by accident. "This violates approximately 47 different principles of civilized problem-solving." Commander Vextool was frantically consulting multiple holographic displays, each one confirming what his eyes were already telling him. The Academy's most secure containment chamber was being systematically demolished by a creature using nothing more sophisticated than the application of kinetic energy to structural weak points. The chamber was tested against every conceivable escape method. We ran simulations involving exotic matter manipulation, temporal paradox exploitation, even theoretical applications of weaponized mathematics. "Did anyone test it against someone simply breaking the wall?" asked the aide. The silence that followed was the sort of silence that typically preceded major revisions to engineering textbooks. The human delivered another kick and another, each impact creating new fractures in the polymer composite until entire sections were beginning to buckle outward. The chamber's internal sensors were registering stress patterns that their programming had categorized as theoretically impossible, which was causing several backup systems to shut down in what could only be described as electronic confusion. "Time elapsed," announced the chamber's countdown system with admirable dedication to duty despite the circumstances. 2 minutes, 14 seconds. The human paused, examined her work with professional satisfaction, and then applied her shoulder to the damaged section of wall. The polymer composite, having reached the limits of its structural integrity, and apparently lacking any philosophical commitment to maintaining its current configuration, surrendered with a sound like a very large, very expensive apology. Sunlight streamed through the newly created exit as the human stepped through the hole she had created, brushing polymer dust off her uniform with the casual efficiency of someone who had just completed a routine maintenance task. She emerged into the Academy's main courtyard, where several maintenance drones were already converging on the breach with the sort of urgent confusion typically reserved for natural disasters or accounting errors. Behind her, 17 holographic interfaces continued their patient wait for a cadet who would never return to solve their elegant puzzles, while 47 separate alarm systems tried to categorize an emergency that their programmers had somehow failed to anticipate during 3 centuries of theoretical preparation. The Academy's emergency response protocol had been designed by committee, which explained why it was simultaneously over-engineered and completely unprepared for actual emergencies. As alarms competed with each other in 17 different languages, emergency lights flashed in patterns that had been optimized for species with color perception ranges spanning 11 dimensions, and automated systems began broadcasting evacuation instructions for scenarios ranging from theoretical reality breach to unexpected philosophy failure. None of them had a category for cadet punched hole in wall. Commander Vextool stood in the observation chamber, staring at the human-shaped hole in what had been the Academy's most secure containment facility, while his 4 eyes processed information that his brain kept rejecting as fundamentally inconsistent with the universe's apparent commitment to logical behavior. Around him, 43 of the galaxy's most sophisticated educators were experiencing the sort of collective intellectual crisis that typically preceded major paradigm shifts or complete nervous breakdowns. "Status report," he said, though his voice carried the tone of someone who suspected that reality had recently submitted its resignation letter. The aide consulted his emergency backup clipboard, which had automatically materialized when the primary system detected what it classified as unprecedented educational catastrophe. "The human has exited the chamber through an improvised aperture created via direct physical force. Time elapsed 2 minutes, 17 seconds. Structural damage extensive. Probability that this was supposed to happen approximately 0. Dr. Quilmaro was examining readings from 17 different sensor arrays, each one confirming that the Academy's most fundamental assumptions about problem solving had just been efficiently demolished by a creature who apparently viewed walls as optional suggestions rather than actual barriers. "The force calculations are disturbing," she said, her voice carrying the sort of academic fascination typically reserved for watching civilizations collapse in real time. "The human applied approximately 800 pounds of directed kinetic energy across multiple impact points. That's within normal parameters for her species' physical capabilities." Normal parameters? Commander Vextool's brain was apparently having difficulty processing information that contradicted several millennia of civilized behavior. "She destroyed a military-grade containment facility using her feet?" "And her shoulder," the aide added helpfully. "The final breach required the application of lateral force against the compromised structural matrix." Outside in the courtyard, the human was calmly answering questions from a maintenance drone whose programming had been designed to handle routine facility problems, not interview cadets who had just redefined the concept of unconventional thinking. The drone's sensors were recording everything, which meant that within approximately 6 hours, detailed analysis of the wall incident would be available to every military academy in the galaxy. "She's explaining her methodology to the maintenance systems," observed Dr. Quilmara, who was monitoring the external sensors with the sort of horrified fascination typically reserved for watching natural disasters unfold in real time. "According to the translation matrix, she's describing the wall as obviously not load-bearing and suggesting that the Academy should consider basic structural engineering as a prerequisite for security system design." The human was indeed providing a comprehensive technical critique of the Academy's containment chamber, delivered in the patient tone of someone explaining simple concepts to particularly slow students. She pointed out that the polymer composite, while excellent for deflecting energy weapons, had never been tested against sustained physical impact. She noted that the chamber's designers had apparently assumed that all potential escapees would approach the problem through intellectual analysis rather than direct action. She observed that the Academy's security systems seemed to have been calibrated for species that had forgotten that walls were physical objects rather than theoretical concepts. "The maintenance drone is asking if she considered attempting the holographic interfaces," the aide reported. She responded that she examined them briefly but determined that they were, quote, "obviously a distraction from the real problem, which was that she was inside a room and needed to be outside a room." Commander Vextil was beginning to understand that the Academy's escape chamber had been designed by beings who thought in puzzles, for beings who thought in puzzles to test beings who thought in puzzles. The possibility that someone might approach the challenge by simply leaving the room through the most direct method available had apparently never occurred to anyone involved in 3 centuries of system development. The psychological evaluation classified her as cognitively primitive, he said, though his voice suggested that he was beginning to question whether primitive might have certain practical advantages over sophisticated. The assessment indicated that humans lack the mental complexity required for advanced tactical thinking. "Sir," the aide said, consulting yet another holographic display that had materialized to track the incident's expanding implications, "I'm receiving reports from Academy facilities on 17 different worlds." Maintenance crews are currently conducting emergency structural assessments of all containment chambers, escape rooms, and security facilities designed using similar specifications. The human had finished her impromptu lecture on basic engineering principles and was now walking toward the Academy's main building with the casual confidence of someone who had just completed a routine assignment. Behind her, the hole in the containment chamber's wall served as a monument to the universe's apparent sense of humor regarding the relationship between intellectual sophistication and practical problem-solving. The other cadets, Dr. Quillmurray said, her voice carrying a note of growing panic, are scheduled to attempt the escape chamber this afternoon. How do we explain that the challenge has been modified? Commander Vexthal stared at the human-shaped aperture that had once been a wall, while his mind processed the implications of explaining to the Academy's board of directors that their most prestigious challenge had been solved in 2 minutes by a species that apparently viewed sophisticated security systems as moderately interesting obstacles rather than insurmountable intellectual barriers. We modify the parameters, he said finally, and we reinforce the walls. How much reinforcement? Asked the aide. Commander Vexthal watched the human disappear into the main building, probably to attend her next class with the same casual efficiency that she had just applied to redefining the Academy's understanding of tactical thinking. All of it, he said. Use all of the reinforcement. The emergency alarms were still broadcasting their confusion in 17 languages, but somehow their multilingual panic seemed less urgent now, as if the universe had already moved on to processing the next phase of what promised to be a very educational day for everyone involved. 3 months later, the Galactic Military Academy's tactical assessment facility bore little resemblance to its former self. Where once stood walls of elegant polymer composite, now rose barriers of reinforced neutronium steel, backed by force field generators that could theoretically contain a small star. The holographic interfaces had been supplemented with proximity sensors, motion detectors, and what the engineering staff privately referred to as human proofing, a series of modifications designed to prevent creatures from solving intellectual challenges through the application of creative violence. The Academy's board of directors had initially attempted to classify the wall incident as an anomaly, a statistical outlier that would require minor adjustments to their testing protocols. This optimism had lasted exactly 4 days, until the second human cadet arrived for assessment and, upon being informed that the escape chamber had been reinforced, asked whether they had also reinforced the ceiling. They had not reinforced the ceiling. The sound of a human-sized individual falling through reinforced polymer composite and landing in the Academy's dean's office had apparently provided a definitive answer to several theoretical questions about the relationship between sophisticated engineering and practical problem-solving. The dean, a crystalline being whose species had evolved beyond physical confrontation approximately 7 million years ago, had required 3 days of meditation and 2 complete system reboots to process what his office security sensors had classified as impossible kinetic event with humorous implications. Commander Vexthal now found himself in the unprecedented position of serving as the Academy's first Director of Human Studies, a position that had been created after the board of directors realized that their existing faculty lacked the psychological framework necessary to understand beings who viewed the universe as a collection of problems waiting to be solved through the application of appropriate force to structurally vulnerable points. Today's assessment involves 17 human cadets, his aide reported, consulting a clipboard that had been reinforced with the same neutronium steel now protecting the Academy's walls. The escape chamber has been upgraded with Class X containment protocols, redundant structural support systems, and what the engineering staff described as probably enough reinforcement. The current containment chamber resembled less an educational facility than a vault designed to store unstable elements that might spontaneously achieve sentience and develop strong opinions about walls. Every surface had been reinforced, every joint had been sealed, and every possible method of creating improvised exits had been, according to 17 different engineering committees, definitively eliminated. Through the observation windows, the assembled faculty watched as the first human cadet entered the chamber and was immediately surrounded by 43 holographic interfaces, each one more elegantly complex than its predecessors. The Academy's finest programmers had spent 3 months developing challenges that would surely appeal to the human preference for practical solutions while still maintaining the intellectual sophistication that defines civilized education. The human walked directly to the center of the chamber, looked up at the ceiling, and asked whether anyone had considered that the ventilation system, might be considered a structural weakness. Emergency lockdown of all atmospheric processing systems, Commander Vex Thule announced, though his voice carried the weary resignation of someone who had spent 3 months learning that human creativity applied to problem solving was effectively indistinguishable from a natural disaster with good intentions. The second human cadet, upon entering her assessment chamber, ignored 43 holographic interfaces and began examining the floor for what she described as obvious weak points in the Foundation support matrix. The third cadet asked whether the Academy's insurance policies covered creative reinterpretation of architectural assumptions. The fourth cadet inquired about the chamber's power supply and whether anyone had considered that disconnecting the holographic systems might constitute a valid solution to the challenge of navigating holographic interfaces. The humans, Dr. Cromara observed, consulting readings from sensors that were now tracking 17 different categories of structural stress, previously unknown to galactic engineering, appear to approach every problem by first determining what assumptions everyone else has made, and then systematically testing whether those assumptions are actually necessary. By the afternoon, the Academy's maintenance staff had developed what they privately called human protocols, a comprehensive system for rapidly repairing facility damage caused by cadets who viewed sophisticated challenges as invitations to explore alternative approaches to basic physics. The protocols included emergency supplies of construction materials, rapid response teams trained in structural repair, and a counseling service for faculty members experiencing what psychologists had classified as reality adjustment syndrome. The transformation extended beyond mere facility modifications. The Academy's curriculum had been revised to include courses on multi-species problem-solving approaches, when simplicity defeats complexity, and basic structural engineering for educators who previously assumed walls were permanent. The final course had proven surprisingly popular among species who had spent millennia assuming that physical barriers were absolute rather than temporary inconveniences waiting for sufficient motivation. The broader implications, Commodore Vex Tool noted in his report to the Galactic Council, suggest that our understanding of tactical thinking may have been somewhat limited by our shared assumption that intelligence necessarily involves solving problems through intellectual complexity rather than practical efficiency. The human cadets, for their part, seemed genuinely confused by the controversy surrounding their approach to problem solving. When interviewed, they consistently expressed surprise that other species viewed walls as permanent features of room design rather than temporary obstacles that could be modified as circumstances required. They demonstrated similar confusion about the concept of impossible challenges, apparently operating under the assumption that any problem could be solved, provided one was willing to question whether the problem had been correctly defined in the first place. The Academy's latest graduation ceremony had required significant modifications to accommodate human traditions, which apparently included celebrating successful problem-solving through the application of what other species had learned to recognize as creative destruction. The ceremony now concluded with a demonstration of properly reinforced facilities designed to contain beings who viewed sophisticated security systems as intellectual exercises with practical solutions. As Commander Vex Thule observed the ceremony from his reinforced observation post, watching human graduates receive their commissions while maintenance crews stood by with emergency repair equipment, he reflected on the universe's apparent commitment to teaching important lessons through the most inconvenient methods possible. The Academy had spent 3 centuries perfecting challenges designed to test intellectual sophistication, only to discover that practical intelligence might involve understanding that sometimes the best solution to being inside a room was simply to leave the room, regardless of whether the room's designers had intended to make leaving particularly difficult. The hole in the original containment chamber had been preserved as a monument to the educational value of having one's fundamental assumptions systematically demolished by creatures who approached problems with a radical assumption that problems existed to be solved rather than admired. Beside it, a small plaque bore an inscription in 17 languages. When sophisticated solutions fail, try hitting it harder. The Academy's transformation had rippled outward through galactic civilization like a particularly educational epidemic. Military contractors across 17 star systems were receiving urgent requests to human-proof their installations, which apparently meant designing facilities that could withstand beings who viewed structural integrity as more of a suggestion than an absolute law. The Galactic Council had established a new committee dedicated to understanding species that don't understand why things should be impossible, Though the committee's first meeting had been postponed indefinitely after 3 members suffered nervous breakdowns upon reviewing preliminary human assessment data. Perhaps most tellingly, the Academy's gift shop now sold commemorative chunks of the original wall, each piece certified as authentically demolished by human logic. The items had become surprisingly popular among species seeking to understand how creatures with such apparently primitive problem-solving capabilities had managed to revolutionize galactic military doctrine through the simple expedient of refusing to accept that walls were permanent features of architectural design. The universe, it seemed, had spent several million years developing increasingly sophisticated ways to make simple problems complicated, only to discover that sometimes the most advanced solution was to remember that complicated problems were often just simple problems wearing fancy disguises. And sometimes those disguises could be removed with sufficient application of kinetic energy to structurally vulnerable points. It was, by any reasonable standard, the most practical piece of educational philosophy the Academy had ever produced.